Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for being with us here tonight. It's nice to have an alternative to Farrell, but we're having a few technical issues behind the scenes. I'm actually excited to be here tonight talking about creative methods because it is something that I've been interested in for a very long time. And it's funny, for most of us, we probably will have the mindset that creative methods are actually considered new methods. But the truth is, they've been around since well before even I was a student, and that was last millennia, sorry. Tonight's focus on creative research methods is not going to be an in-depth coverage of how to go about doing a whole lot of different methods, but what I hope it will be, and why I've termed it an exploration of opportunities, is I hope it can be an eye-opener as to the different things or the different approaches and the different innovations. Not that I am comfortable using that word, but you'll understand soon enough. But the different approaches and innovations to research. All too often, I feel we are stuck in a very traditional quantitative, qualitative framework when there's actually so much more to the typical research approaches that we can embrace and we can utilize for our research. So for tonight, I have 5 objectives. The first one is to explore the opportunities for embracing creative research methods at postgraduate level. And I put that one at postgraduate level for a very specific reason. In many PhD level dissertations, we're probably not fully aware of how to embrace creative methods. And as such, creative methods as part of a typical dissertation is not that usual. It's not uncommon, but it's certainly not the mainstream yet. It is something that we can use at any postgraduate level, including master's degree. So it is valid for us. A lot of more experienced researchers who are interested in creative methods use it in terms of shorter research projects and also consultancy research projects. So there is scope not only for us as research candidates in the university system, but what we do postdoctoral or postgraduate study. I want to understand what we mean by the concept creative research methods and kind of a little bit just how they have evolved in academic history. I think it's important to understand where we've come from a methodological perspective, and just how recent a lot of that development has been. We want to explore different creative approaches to research, and more importantly, to recognize that there are still so many, 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 many more opportunities and approaches to explore. I cannot cover in the time I've got tonight even a small amount of what there really is for us to talk about. But if I open the door so that you can see where some of the possibilities are and where they will continue to be, then hopefully into the future, you will find appropriate junctures at which creative methods will help inform your approach to research. I also want to understand the interplay between traditional research approaches and creative methods, because it's not an us or them situation. It's not about, I'm going to only do creative methods and I leave everything else behind. And it's also not the same. For example, I'm not going to do a quantitative approach. Therefore, I have to ignore the opportunity for creative methods engagement within my research. So I want to look at how we are bringing the two together. And finally, me being me, obviously talking about ethics. I want to appreciate the ethical issues that we might encounter when embracing creative research methods. Actually, the issues aren't different, but the level of incorporation that we need, or the level of thinking that we need associated with that, of course, changes with select creative methods. And we've got to make sure that we adjust, as a research candidate, that we adjust our application for ethics approval through the ethics committee or internal review board, or whatever your university calls it, to make sure that we have got an acceptable balance along the continuum of ethics. So that's the purposes, that's the objectives for tonight. My purpose, per se, is, look, I'm not here to teach creative research methods. Yes, I can, and there's probably a lot more people out there who are more equipped to do that. But I am here to open our eyes as to how creative research methods can both be embraced in and for our research. And you'll notice I've made a little note to that, both in and for. So in as a method to help us gather data, for as a way for us to further develop our understanding. So that becomes our development as a researcher. So let's start off with a little understanding of research methods, be they creative or not. And I wanted to start off by talking about, very briefly, the qualitative, quantitative legacy. And I sort of put a little bit of tongue-in-cheek in here, you know, the qualitative, quantitative divide in research, be it the chicken and the egg, which one came first. If we go back to 1747, supposedly this is our first systematic clinical trial. In 1838, the concept of the questionnaire was invented. In the early 1900s, research interviews emerged. Interviews existed prior, but how we can use them for research evolved. And in the 1940s, this evolved into the focus group method. Now, we sort of have a little bit of qual-quant interchange. You know, there's a thought that a quantitative approach came first, followed by qualitative. At the end of the day, not a lot appears to really have changed that much. Most of us doing qualitative research will somehow engage with an interview or a focus group. Most of us who have an interest in quantitative social science research will have an engagement with a questionnaire or survey. Not a lot has changed, and not a lot will change for many people into the future. But I want to argue something else. This is very much a Western-dominated method. And because of that, we've got this focus point that has transformed itself into research around the world, but we tend to break things conveniently into these old hat labels. I have a strong interest in Indigenous research methodologies, and I'm talking about this because, to me, this is where creative research methods, as we interpret the discussion, has part of its, I don't want to say origins, but part of its interest in starting. When I was very early in my career, my research focused around the use of oral history. And although I did that... Sorry, I'll just mute that person. Although I did that within business research, oral history has actually been a very strong, enduring theme across societies and across culture. Some of the people that taught me in my early both undergraduate and master's, first level of postgraduate, had a strong interest in folklore and folklore research, and myself included, was able to look at the concepts of folklore and how they influenced modern thinking. So this is sort of going back to storytelling, but it goes from folklore, it goes to lineage, because we can look at understanding how tribes or communities have grown and how they've spread out over time. And it goes way beyond this as well. In terms of Indigenous research methodology to inform research that we're doing, it has been increasingly embraced in the literature. A lot more contemporary researchers are looking at practicing Indigenous methodology or Indigenous-based methodologies. Now, there are some ethical issues with that. There are some reflexivity issues with that as well, about are we, or positionality issues with that as well. Are we the right people? Do we have the cultural background to do this research? Are we insiders? Are we outsiders? All of those are incredibly relevant issues. My point for tonight is not about whether we should be doing this. My point is just simply honing or putting across the fact that Indigenous research methodologies have some parallels to creative research methodologies, because they look outside the traditional paradigms that academic research wants us to believe is the only way to do research. What we have found is not only are Indigenous research methodologies becoming more embraced in the literature, that they're actually becoming increasingly appreciated as a different viewpoint, a different way of examining similar issues, so that we are getting different narratives, we are getting different perspectives, we are seeing different worldviews, and we're able to start deconstructing some of what we previously get as research and bringing into it new insights, more deeper, informative insights that help us as researchers to be able to progress. Indigenous research is considered holistic. It's certainly in most cases relationship-based, and that's where the qualitative, quantitative, typical approaches aren't as well integrated in that sense, because they are less relationship-based. It is argued that Indigenous methods are ethical because they actually understand the cultures that are being observed or studied. They understand it at a different level to what an outsider might do, but it brings it something more embraced into it. So it becomes culturally embedded. The method itself is culturally embedded. It becomes culturally sensitive. Now we have to ask the question, is it creative? Or my question here, is it original? Because research didn't start only with, let me go back a date. Research didn't start only in 1838 with a questionnaire, for example. It's actually a technique that has been passed down generation after generation after generation. Now, I'm talking about Indigenous methodology because I see a linkage from Indigenous to creative. Not that they're the same thing, they're certainly not, but I do see that some of the inspiration from understanding and being able to engage with and embrace Indigenous methodology actually lends itself to inspiration that we can use in embracing creative research methods as well. Now, I want to start with the case for being creative. And you've probably gathered from what I've just talked about that maybe I'm a little bit cynical about the typical quantitative, qualitative tools that we have. And it's not that I'm cynical about them massively. I am cynical. But what I'm saying is, look, not all of the research that we can undertake needs to fit into those convenient labels or those convenient boxes. Sometimes it's important to look differently. Now, I'm going to give two cases for us as researchers becoming or being creative in our approach to methods. And I'm going to start with an academic argument because, that's what we are. But I'm also going to end up in a common sense argument. And I think the common sense argument is quite important. From an academic side, let's be realistic. Traditional research approaches don't always address the research question as adequately as we would desire. Now, we know this for a few things. If you do your sort of the very typical, let's do our research gap, identify our research gap from the literature, we will often discover that, look, people have tried to study the same thing using slightly different typical approaches and not really getting any deeper with the answer that they've got. So we know for a fact that realistically, traditional or typical research methods don't actually address always the desire, or don't always adequately address how we go about getting our responses. Now, ultimately, we want to be impactful. We want to have that point of difference. And creativity allows us the opportunity, maybe the flexibility, but certainly it allows us the opportunity to just have that point of difference. I want to argue that the truth is research is inherently creative. Our problem is, as creative academics or academics, we put it in a convenient box most of the time. So we're actually limiting ourselves and limiting our research by framing everything in convenient frameworks that have been predetermined for some time. Sometimes we have to go outside of that concept. So our questions are often very creative as researchers. So therefore, my question to you is, why, in many cases, are our solutions not? Why do we sort of go for the mainstream, the comfortable, the convenient? We need to do better. It's also an opportunity for us to advance the discipline. And why I put here method as well as findings. Most of us go into a doctoral program in order to obtain findings. We want to learn about a phenomenon being studied, being researched. I'm going to argue that for a good number of us, actually advancing the method is just as important or valuable as advancing the findings that are achieved as well. On a flip side, but academic, which I feel is very important for us, is creative outputs, i.e. the dissertations. Creative dissertations are on the rise too. And I wanted to share two examples very briefly. There is a PhD dissertation from New Zealand, which looked at South Pacific communities. It's not a 500-page, beautifully typed document, but it is actually a very large tapestry, a tapa cloth, which is indigenous. So here you'll see the link back, indigenous to certain cultures within the South Pacific. But the tapa cloth tells a story. It is a community story often, or a story of a family, or a story of an individual. The individual who conducted this PhD research, utilizing traditional indigenous research methodologies not only looked at the methodologies for the input, i.e., how did they collect data, but they used it as a way of creating the output, the dissertation. And the dissertation became a very sizable tapa cloth, which expressed the story of the research being told. Yes, there was a viva, and yes, questions were asked and answered. But what I'm pointing at is a fundamentally traditional dissertation is not always going to be the output that you are going to have to give. Now, I'm not saying everybody go out and make a tapestry, because that's not going to work for us all. But I am saying there are alternatives. A second alternative was a gentleman from the US. I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago. He was interested in the sociology of rap music within a particular community. And rather than write a dissertation, as most of us, probably all of us really, are doing, he composed his own rap CD and submitted that as the dissertation. Now, again, I'm not encouraging you to go out and do this, but I am saying that mainstream universities are accepting creative-based outputs or creative-based dissertations that do not conform to the typical 5-chapter model. They are graduating with this. So not only do we have to be creative in our methodology, we actually have the opportunity to be creative in how we express or communicate our research. Now, I think next week's topic is actually communicating your research, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm going to show a couple of these examples, because the dissemination and the communication of research doesn't have to follow our typical journal paper, 5-chapter, whatever. There are flexibilities. Now let's move into a common sense scenario before we really get into what creative methods are going to be and how we go about them, how we think about them. Common sense is creative methods support collaboration and connection. It is about community. It is about action research. It is about having the respondent, the researched, the person being researched, the researchee or the researched, being part of the process of data collection in a more active way. So it is about building connections, and it's not just about interviews as connections, because it is a connection, but it's about finding alternative ways to accommodate for people who might not be comfortable, for example, in an interview situation. Common sense also tells us, look, it sparks fresh perspectives. By approaching a problem in a different way, by trying to uncover and collect data in ways that are different from the norm, that also helps us and our respondents think about different things. Everybody has something unique that they could contribute. It also surfaces inner dimensions. Sometimes, in order to really express something, we actually need to do it in a different way for us. So if we look at some of the arts-based creative methods, that might include asking your participants to keep a visual diary, for example. That helps us as we think about what we're going to do, what we're going to put together to submit, to give to the researcher. It actually helps us think through some of the things ourselves. So we might recognize or realize something, either consciously or subconsciously, that we put into that. That might be something that is not noticed or not elicited from a more traditional interview or focus group or questionnaire. And I think finally, the common sense case, the final common sense case, is to empower adoption and transformation. And this is really getting that everybody's contribution has a potential to influence some outcomes. And by being part of research in a non-conventional way, or being part of research in a creative way, we may actually be a bigger part of transforming the community of interest at the same time. So let's move into what are creative methods. And it's really annoying if you go onto Google, because, most of us will do that for a minute, and you search creative research methods, you're not getting a lot out there. There is stuff, but you're not really getting a full definition. You're getting a sense for what it can be. And I want to say we get a sense for it because it's evolving significantly. How it was viewed 10 years ago is significantly different today because ideas have evolved, ways to think through a problem and find ways to interact with the researched, with respondents, has blossomed significantly. But anyway, let's go through a couple of sort of very loose definitions, loose framework here. Creative research is the name of an emerging field that seeks to develop new ways of understanding, situating, and reconfiguring knowledge in the telematic age. Now, I kind of put telematic into brackets because I don't want to suggest that creative methods is only related to digital or to communications, electronic communications, but an early definition had it as that. I want to focus on the fact that it is about understanding and situating. So how do we bring different worldviews and representations of those worldviews to what we're doing, and how we reconfigure knowledge? Because chances are, by layering creative methods around existing studies, we are actually going to get a deeper appreciation of some of the issues and themes at hand. Creative methods engage participants outside the parameters of traditional, again brackets, qualitative data collection. I want to challenge that because their argument is, look, creative methods can be engaged or embraced through a quantitative study as well. We'll come back to that shortly, but creative methods engage participation outside the parameters of traditional data collection and analysis. They often include empathetic, artistic, narrative, or aesthetic expression as the basis for investigating, intervening. So now we're getting into action research, creating knowledge, and sharing information. The key part, such methods are intended to evoke deeper research insights and richer or more nuanced interpretations. That, to me, is important. That's why, not only what is creative methods, but it's why we would want it, because we can get more unique, deeper insights that are there. They facilitate meaning, making and highlighting alternative types of knowledge and ways of knowing. And ways of knowing, it comes back to, again, our worldview, our frames of reference, and our understanding of what knowledge means. As researchers, at some stage in our career, whether it be early, mid, or later, you are going to address the question of, what does knowledge actually mean to you? How is knowledge created? How is knowledge founded? And how does knowledge evolve? And there's an entire set of studies and literature with that addresses this. Part of what we have to evolve to do is to be able to address that question itself. In creative research, The researcher is allowed to include their creative practice, which includes their use of imagination, their use of original ideas, their creative methods or creative output in research as part of that output. So you actually get a researcher who is more closely situated to the research that is at hand. Now that's positionality and all the issues we talk about for that, all extremely valid, but it's something that we get an opportunity to be closer to the research that we do. What does creative research methods embrace? It is new or different approaches, new data collection ideas. So how do we actually get data that helps us answer our research question? We're using new ways of obtaining that. And ultimately, it's a departure from, I want to call it tried and proven because that's what most people will say. I've put it in brackets, stale approaches. If the 5 researchers before you, utilizing typically common qualitative or quantitative methods, have failed to come up with any new insights on the same problem, despite they recognize that previous researchers haven't addressed the problem well, then we know that the approach is stale. We have to be inventive. And we don't become inventive with the population of study. We don't become particularly more inventive with how can I refine my research question, or how can I create a more nuanced research question. We have to become more creative with our approach to actually obtaining data. The biggest misconceptions about creative research method is creative is only qualitative. No, it is, or there is a relationship, there is a connectivity to quantitative research as well. And let me address that in more detail when I talk about multi-method research shortly, not only mixed methods, but multi-method research. There's a misconception that creative research is only arts-based, and arts-based is performative or visual. It's well beyond that. There's an argument that creative is new, and I've seen people say, creative methods is the next best, the next new thing. In the 1990s, some of the work that was coming through, even in the 1980s, some of the work that was coming through in my original discipline, which is human geography, social geography, environmental geography, was actually very creative based. I just never realized that we should call it creative methods, because to me it was intuitive methods about how do we find things out, how do we study a situation. So creative is not new. There's a misconception that creative has no rigor. It's not robust, it's not reliable, it's not solid. Creative methods are incredibly rigorous if you apply the right ethical standards to them, and if you structure them in a way that really helps you as the researcher to connect to the researched and to interpret what they are giving you or what they are sharing with you in the form of data. So there is rigor. Some will argue that creative is only for data gathering. But as I expressed with the Tarpa-Cloth, with the RAP-CD, and with everything else, it's not only for data gathering, it is the interpretation, it is the nuanced understandings, it's the opening one's mind to opportunities, but it's also in terms of how we output our research as well. And for some people, creative is fringe. And I know there will be people in the audience tonight who say, well, creative research, it's not wrong, but creative research really is on the fringe of research. It's not mainstream. And I put the word experimental, not as in, get the Bunsen burner and a few chemicals, but us as perhaps social scientists or business researchers experimenting. It's valid, very valid approaches that just help us find a new way of eliciting information in terms of what we need. Let's move into creative methods per se, because now we're going to look at actually what methods are available to us. I'm going to start with Artspace because that's where most people sense or feel or think towards creative methods. So Artspace is really about a focus on the artistic process. So this can be artistic expression in all forms as a way of understanding, which means visual, it means performance, it means narrative, and it's also the intersection of artistic processes and technology. So what do we have now? The digital arts that are available. Now, collection of Artspace is about having your respondent, having the researched, the people being researched, having the respondents use artistic processes to be able to express events, situations, day-to-day activities, representations, reactions to certain events. Things that we might do in a focus group may be put into a visual diary, may be put into mental maps. So years ago, I was involved in teaching a course on environmental psychology. I'm very interested in, or I was in my early career, very interested in how human nature understands and represents the environment. And one of the very classic, well, it's classic for me, it's creative in this terms, but one of the very classic research approaches was the drawing of mental maps by children. And what it enabled researchers to do, both psychologists and human geographers, social geographers, what it enabled us to do was to explore the local environment, the local neighborhood, through the eyes of children, through asking them to map out what's important to them in their local environment. Now, we can sort of look at our phones and we can get up Waze or we can get up maps or something like that, and we see things in scale. Children or other people, to be honest, if I asked you to draw a mental map, it will be different. But children see their environment in terms of key landmarks, in terms of things or places that make them happy, in terms of things or places that they are fearful of. And these are all represented in the mental maps that they draw. Now, you could not sit with a 6-year-old child and do an interview or a focus group to get a sense of how they connect to their immediate neighborhood, where they are fearful, where they are happy, where they undertake most of their activities, where they spend most of their time, because they don't have the spoken capacity, the vocabulary even, let alone the fluency. They don't have that to be able to express it in a way that we might as adults. But through the use of drawings, through the use of color, through the representation of distances and the intricacy of how they draw certain things versus other things, they're actually showcasing important areas or important aspects for them. And you're able to get a much deeper understanding of what within the local environment is relevant for them. Now, that's one technique. We kind of have a lot of techniques. So photos actually a photo diary, taking photographs of certain things, drawings, diaries, icons, emojis, using and reacting to artifacts, something that either the researcher supplies and asks you to respond to, or something that I ask you as my respondent to talk about. Whether I use maps, whether I use collages, whether I create music, poetry, textiles, and performances. All of these are techniques and opportunities that fit into arts-based research. Now, they're very useful if we want to get subjective experience, if we want to understand abstract concepts. Maybe we're working with sensitive topics. So say, for example, let's give an example. We're undertaking research about child sexual abuse. Imagine with a 5-year-old trying to actually get the 5-year-old to talk about it. A 5-year-old is very likely to be able to express feelings, concerns, emotions through artistic work. The art may be terrible, but you'll get what they mean, but they won't be able to use words for that. Now, that's going to pose us challenges anyway, because we have to think, how do I interpret it? But it does give an avenue for people who are not yet ready to speak. It's great for working with children or researching children because it cuts out the need for language in many cases. It's great to work for people, it's great for researching those who speak different languages to us, because we use visual representation more so than we use textual or text-based representation. It's helpful if we're working with people with communication difficulties. So, for example, that might be an intellectual issue. It may also be the fact that there are people who cannot speak or who cannot write. So finding a more visual or artistic approach helps. And it's also good if you're working with groups of mixed abilities or mixed ages, so that you actually level through, or you cut through all of the responses that you get and try to sort of, I don't want to say average, because that's not really a fair word, but it's trying to get meaning out of everybody's representation. There are limitations though. And, think about this. We're using photos, drawings, diaries, poetry, textiles, all of that. It's not going to work for everybody. Let's be realistic. But it might work for some of your research. The challenges, the limitations become, look, there is from some respondents a discomfort to engage in creative activities. As an adult, my drawing sucks. I can't draw anything. If I do a mental map, it's not going to be pretty. Now, you might say, just draw what you feel. That's fine. I'm going to look at it, and because I don't feel happy about it, I'm not necessarily being the best representation of what I want to share. There is a variation in artistic ability. So even when we ask kids to draw mental maps, or let's assume we ask teenagers to take photographs every 5 minutes during their day, some photographs are going to be nicely positioned. If I take a photograph, I stand there, my hand shakes, and my photograph becomes blurry, which means it's difficult to use. It's difficult for the researcher to use. There is a time commitment. If I research using a focus group, I'm probably spending a couple of hours. I'm asking my participants to spend a couple of hours. If I'm engaging with arts-based communication, arts-based research methods, approaches, I'm probably expecting a stronger, a greater amount of time out of my respondents, which means the time commitment is bigger. It might be harder to get the individual concerned, and multiple individuals, of course, to actually be willing to commit to participating in your research. And the final limitation, not the only final one, but the final main one, is often arts-based research methods get respondents who reproduce common cultural conventions. So they become ubiquitous, not unique. If you ask me to take a photograph every 10 minutes of my day to diarize what I'm doing, chances are I'm going to go down one of 2 or 3 ways. And the first way will be, actually one of 3 ways first. I might consider every photograph to be a selfie. Now, nobody wants to look at my face. I'll be honest with that. But imagine if that's how I do it. So I'm going to focus on me as an individual, not the environment, not the activity, not anything else. So that doesn't give you insights into what I do that's unique every 10 minutes of my day. Secondly, I might photograph on environmental factors. So that might be landmarks or places or food. Especially if you're feral, you'll photograph food. But I might be focused on landmarks or key things that are recognized. So I live in KL. We have a couple of old landmarks and we have a nice new landmark in terms of a very large tower building. Chances are, if I go about my business every 10 minutes and I'm taking a photo, I'm going to look at framing that within my photograph. Now, that's not helpful because my photographs become ubiquitous. They're all the same. I'm not seeing something unique. I'm not getting a flower. I'm not getting a door. I'm not getting a pothole. I'm not getting a screaming, angry customer running out of a shop. I'm getting that tower in most of my photographs. So we run that risk. And sometimes the third way that we look at, especially if we're spending time with other people, if we're not photographing ourselves and we're not photographing boring landmarks, chances are we're photographing the boring people. I mean, the other people we're with are doing duck faces and silly things like that. So again, we're not getting random unique. We actually tend to reproduce the same sorts of things. The same works in our art. If you ask me to draw something about my job, you're probably going to get a typically common picture about what a teacher does. And that's not always going to help us. So there are limitations. Our job as a researcher is to look at how can I elicit more authentic or unique contributions from those who are participating in my research. Now we have technology-based research as a creative research methodology. And it's not really so much a methodology. I much rather call this research using technology, because it's technology-assisted research more than anything else. Now, 2023 in particular, we saw some massive changes. And we talk about artificial intelligence. We talk about ChatGPT. We talk about all of the other AI tools that are available out there. I was at Monash University this afternoon. I've been doing training there for the last couple of days, and I was talking about an upcoming program. And we were actually spending some time with the person coordinating this, talking about Monash University's response to AI. And I found it very refreshing that as a university, they're embracing it, when a number of other universities are certainly trying to quash it. Now, at the end of the day, embracing it means they're encouraging research candidates to look at how can we ethically use AI to enhance either our data collection or our data analysis and our visual representation or our textual representation of the research that we do as well. So it comes into things typically before ChatGPT got into mainstream existence. It came down to things like data collection. How do I use technology to collect data? Data transcription. So how do I take my interviews? How do I get word for word transcription? How do I get and interpret, and this becomes the analysis part, tonality analysis, frequency of words, all this. And how do I also engage with technology embedded arts-based research? So for example, if I want you to create a collage, it may involve you doing some drawing. It may also involve you taking photographs, and it may involve you bringing all of that together on Adobe or whatever the software is on a tablet computer and building a representation of how you see your neighborhood or how you experienced a particular phenomenon through time. So we have technology embedded arts-based as well. It brings us to things like software, for example, NVivo. And there's actually some really good NVivo free webinars at the moment. I'll try and post them up. They're not run by the Third Degree. They're run by an organization that specializes in NVivo. But for those of you who are interested in how NVivo or similar software might work, those are definitely worth going for. But technology-based creative research methods is using NVivo to help us understand traditional qualitative, or even in some extent quantitative, but traditional methods, and it's putting a different layer of understanding for us on it. It's also speeding up the process. We have platforms, and I've mentioned two platforms. ChatGPT, we all know. Harkness.ai is a platform I interacted with a few years ago, and it actually enables you to take meetings and analyze the frequency and flow and direction of communication along with the tonality analysis of the communication, who has the major share, etc., 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 of voice during a discussion or during a particular interaction. So this can be used in focus groups. As a researcher, we might host a focus group and we might put our themes on it and we're listening for the answers. The technology then says, you know what? Craig spoke 16% of the time. Farrell spoke 34% of the time. But out of that 34% of the time, 63% was using an aggressive tone. And I'm suddenly getting all this added detail, which intuitively I might have thought Farrell spoke a lot and he was angry, but I'm getting it as measurable, codable data. And finally, one that I found very creative is the fact that it involves communication tools. So one of the biggest research pivots that happened during the pandemic, especially during the lockdowns, was not the fact that we went online for a lot of things, because yes, we can do interviews online. We've always had Skype, for the last 20 something years. We can do focus groups online through Zoom, not a big deal. A number of organizations that were customer facing, who suddenly no longer had the ability to reach out to their customers in the typical way, were engaging with delivery platforms, ride-sharing applications, and so forth, to actually use the delivery riders, the delivery drivers, using WhatsApp as a conduit to be able to, as they're delivering, because they're the only people who could get out there, as they're delivering, to be able to get customers to interact with them, to be able to address some of the research questions. Now, that was commercial research as opposed to academic research. So bear with me for a moment. What it did was it normalized using platforms, or I should say communication tools like WhatsApp, as a way of interacting between the researcher and the researchee and collecting data, because it can be done in real time, it can be done synchronous, asynchronous, it can be stored, it can be saved, it can be played back, it can be analyzed in terms of text, it can be analyzed in terms of tonality, so many opportunities. So that became a technology-based conduit to support and enhance or legitimize an existing research methodology. So I'm going to leave you with a question on this page before I move into the next slide. What technology elements could you ethically incorporate into your own research? Now let's talk about mixed or multiple methods. And I've done quite a few webinars over the past few years that have looked at mixed methods, and I don't want to revisit a lot of that. What I want to revisit is what I call the exciting contortions of mixed methods. And I get excited by this because we tend to present models of mixed methods as one being first, different one being the second, etc., etc. And it becomes, mixed methods embraces our standard qualitative, quantitative tools. Our job is to shake it up, and I shake it up in a couple of ways. One, multi-methods. It's not only mixed, it's multi. You might use 6 different qualitative methods and not a single quantitative. So you become a multi-method rather than mixed. Or you might use a creative method first to inform a quantitative method and then reinforce that with traditional qualitative or creative methods beyond that. What I want to focus on for mixed or multi-methods is, look, we can be very creative with how qualitative and quantitative, different qualitative, all blend or all interact with each other to be able to create something a little bit more interesting. Now, when I think about this, I'm not sure if Savi is here tonight. If you are, you'll probably scream at me since I'm using you as an example. Savi is doing her PhD on effective teaching methods in science education at upper secondary school. And she is actually using a multi-method approach that's not very conventional. It's not about we're doing one before the other before the other. She has 3 phases of research. Within each phase of research, there is a mixed or multi-methods approach to that, including elements of creative methods. At the end of the day, she has a very complicated approach with about 9 separate research activities, all feeding into each other to culminate in an understanding of whether an intervention, a program that she designed, a teaching program that she designed, made improvements in student results. Now, why I use that as an example is because I think it's a great idea of where creative methods intersectioning with mixed methods or multi-methods is helpful. We have to be creative with our approach to mixed or multi-method studies, and that's really what I want to focus on. We look at it in terms of contextualizing. So maybe, what sort of social frame we use, and then how do we go about exploring that? We also use it in terms of data analysis and the techniques that we use, whether it be narrative, discourse analysis, thematic analysis, and so forth. If we're looking at quantitative data, it actually comes down to what I was talking about a few weeks ago with data visualization. It's the different approaches that we can visualize the data that we get so that people can look into it, express, understand it, interpret our visual representation of it in a more interesting way. It therefore comes down to the structure of your mixed methods approach. Creswell, Plano-Clark, all of the writing that they put, which sort of prescribe for us a typical mixed method study, give us something like 7 different contortions. I'm going to say that, first of all, mixed methods is creative because those 7 contortions are the start. They are not only 7. They lead themselves into thousands of possibilities. But as we bring in, say, for example, technology-based or arts-based research methods to it as well, we actually can become super creative or super innovative with the research, the approach to the research that we did. In terms of here, again, my question, how can you embrace creative research methods in a mixed methods model? And I want to move on to the last one before I head into ethics and then head towards a Q&A session. Transformative research is research aiming to challenge, to change, to impact what might be seen as the dominating position or the status quo in society. It's research that we do that's aimed at changing a part of your participants' lives. Now, that's if we're social science researchers. We might not be going that deep in business faculty, but there will be applications of it as well. But there are really 3 types of transformative research that that are embraced by the creative research methods movement. And one is being participatory. So we involve the people you're working with through the research in the decision-making processes about the agenda, the process, and action. So this gets us involved with people in terms of peer-to-peer evaluations, self-reporting, autoethnography, ethnography studies. We move into action research as being the second that fit or that is comfortable under the transformative umbrella. And that's where the researcher and the participants work together to diagnose the issue or problem to be addressed. And then they implement the solution that's based on that you've created. Now, that's actually the research that I'm describing for Savia, because she's working with educators to understand the shortfalls in the current programs. She's then designing a solution for that, implementing the solution and testing to see whether it works. All very good. How we can go about that, again, we have peer-to-peer evaluations. Shadowing, so that's actually following. So in her case, she will be sitting in and observing teachers, watching what they do, and seeing if they are, more like observational research in a way, but not influencing what they do, just following them to see the interactions. So a little bit of slightly distanced observational research. We use tools like diaries, tools like journals to help us with that. And finally, we have what's termed community-based research. And this is research that aims to explore community-based research questions. Now, some of us at doctoral level will be motivated by the concept, by the mandate, perhaps, for us to do community-based research. And the point here is, look, only through understanding a community does it become possible for you to know what will work with them, that the work you're doing, whether it's going to be effective or not with them. And this gives us, we're trying to make an impact. We're trying to help the community. It gives us a chance to do things like workshops, much like what I'm doing now in a way. digital storytelling, photography, peer-to-peer interviewing and evaluations. So we bring different tools. If I go back for a minute, I talk about Artsbrace, I give some examples. Some of those filter through elsewhere. Some of them feel like they're independent. What I want to focus on, or what the key point I want to make through tonight is creative research isn't predetermined. Creative research methodologies are not predetermined. It's taking something we've got, it's approaching it in new or unconventional ways that still enable us to get the results that help us with our data. Now, we can also talk about the fact that it is an evolution of traditional research methodology practice. So creative research method involves the innovation of, or the evolution of, existing methods to enhance and refine. So a few examples that I've got here are walking interviews. So we can all do interviews, but sometimes we tend to think of an interview as being in a room situation, i.e. we go to a cafe, or we book a meeting room and we go somewhere that is a neutral space. A walking interview is literally an interview when you're just exploring an environment. If I'm doing geographic research, I may use that to help point out or elicit certain ideas. I might be doing a walking interview to provide a different level of comfort and convenience for the respondent. Walking around a neighborhood while drinking a cup of coffee and talking about issues tends to make a person less guarded and more relaxed. Therefore, they're more likely to open up to you and give you information that you're hoping they're going to reveal during the interview process. So it's an example. We have enhanced focus groups or discussion groups. And an enhanced focus group really is us taking away our role as the mediator or the facilitator and letting the group evolve the discussion in their own way, in a much faster, much stronger method to anything else. We use WhatsApp videos, and this is the thing that I get excited by, because I honestly think it's a great way for us as researchers to connect with people that might not necessarily be available in our geographical space. So, for example, to get a respondent to agree to do an interview, they come to our space, they come to our office, for example, or we go to theirs. That means we're limited to a neighborhood, or we're limited to a city. Zoom is great, but not everybody has the bandwidth to enable Zoom for interviews. So softening down the technology, something that most people can reasonably access, actually means we can expand the potential response target, a target response or target population of respondents, sorry. We actually have more people that we might be able to engage with. We might do tablet or phone diaries. I'll give you an iPad mini and I'll ask you to keep a diary. I'm giving you something, you're more likely to do that. Actually, if you give me a physical diary and you ask me, too hard to get the diary down, and you ask me to keep a diary, handwriting can be tiresome. But you know what? If I've got a tablet computer, or even if I'm using a phone, and I send myself a voice message once a day, 45 seconds, I can share that with you. You can start analyzing it. It gives me a record. I don't have to write something down. And better yet, if you've ever seen my handwriting, it's absolutely shocking. Nobody can read it. It actually resolves some of those issues. And then we have things like movement trackers. So our phones that map out for us everywhere we've been. There's ethics associated with that. Let me get to that before I go to the Q&A session, of course. But movement trackers are ways of finding out what your interactions with your neighborhood are. So if you have the horrible ankle bracelet that criminals have, I can still track everywhere you've gone. I can track your movement within a house. I can track your movement within streets. I can identify how long you've stopped at certain places, how long you're on the move for. All of that, depending on what my research is, gives me a tool that is better than you taking notes about it and giving it back to me. It becomes more accurate for me. So what we can look at with creative methods is not designing or coming up with a whole new method, but taking existing ones and saying, what can we do differently that will create an environment of safety, i.e. the walking interviews, the discussion groups, or what technology can we embrace to help polish and make our research desire more accessible to the respondents that we hope we're going to have. Now, let me just sort of talk about situating ourselves for a moment, because this is about the fact that creative research methods ultimately mean that we are closer to the research than we might be if we're using more mainstream qualitative or quantitative approaches. So in here, just give me a second, the role of intuition in creative methods. And I think it's important because intuition, I talk about this a lot in research, as a researcher, as we develop our intuition as to what should work, what shouldn't work, what's right, what's wrong, what could go wrong, actually becomes stronger, it becomes better. And I hope, and I do personally believe it makes us better researchers. But creative methods means we've got to be intuitive as to that. And intuition plays a role in our development. Our intuition in creative research methods is important when it comes to processes. Is it logical? Is it going to happen? Do you think you can execute it this way? If you ask somebody to draw a picture, what do you really think you're going to get? If I ask this particular individual to draw a picture, what do you think you're going to get? Are they going to be able to respond in a way that aligns with your method that you've created, or are you going to have to work with them in a different way? We're going to look at the dangers because our intuition can tell us, there are some challenges here. And the dangers come into ethics. So if, for example, I'm working with children, and if I ask children to take photographs of their day, children aren't necessarily fully aware of what they're photographing. So it may be issues about photographing individuals who have not given informed consent. That's not such of a danger. But it may be children putting themselves at danger to take a photograph to impress the adult, i.e. you as the researcher. And therefore, we're putting the children's safety at risk because they want to do better for us. There are limitations. As we think about, I'm going to use this method, as I'm going to do it this way, we're also going to have to use our intuition to say, you know what? It's a good thing in theory. It looks like it's going to be really useful. But there are going to be limitations, and we've got to recognize that, sometimes even a creative method which seems okay, after the first few times of embracing it, we might say it's not quite there yet. There's something missing, or it's not turning out the way we would like it to be. We use our intuition in terms of expansion and extension. So how do I take an existing method or an existing approach? How do I refine it? How do I make it better? How do I make it stronger? So our intuition helps us say, you know what, it's nice to do it this way. This is technology will be an example. You know, I want to use WhatsApp, and I'm very happy to use WhatsApp video as a way of connecting with people. And I want to connect with people in Central Africa, for example. Now, my intuition should tell me, the access to Wi-Fi may not be quite what I expect it to be compared to where I live. And my other intuition should tell me that the cost of access to Wi-Fi may actually be significantly more there in relation to income or average spending than it is in the place that I exist, or the place that I live, the place I'm conducting the research from. So my intuition helps me grow things, but it's also going to say, you know what, it might not work this way, or there may be other factors that influence us. We look at scope, we look at opportunities. And intuition in opportunities was when we see something, say, you know what, I reckon I could try doing it a different way. And we try it. And if it works, we then codify it as a more sustainable, robust method as we progress. Now, the final slide before I go for Q&A is ethics in and ethics of creative research methods. And I wanted to finish with ethics because being creative doesn't mean we throw ethics out the window. Being creative means we embrace ethics, but we have to update our approach. So my simple points are, look, the same ethical standards and considerations apply to creative research methods as they do to any other research method. Ethics is always going to be a negotiation. Ethics sits on a continuum. In order to get some information, sometimes you have to take a shortcut. You have to justify that shortcut. Maybe you don't get informed consent, but you certainly make sure that there is no possible way of identifying an individual. Creative arts-based methods may give us more opportunity to identify an individual, even though we're not putting their name to what they do, because we might identify a style of artwork, or in the drawings, in the photographs, there may be individuals who haven't given us informed consent, but they become published in our research output because they're part of the body of evidence that was provided by the individuals participating. So we have to think about, how do we negotiate around those particular issues? So we still worry about informed consent. We still have to think about voluntary participation, because many creative research methods still require there to be acknowledged voluntary participation, i.e. they know they're there. So informed consent and voluntary. Non-harm, we conduct research not to harm the individuals. Well, I'm going to add something else. I'm going to say, what about long-term embarrassment? Because if I'm doing photographs, or if I'm doing diary entries that may be available at a particular age, I may not see anything wrong with it, but 10 years later, I may not, as the respondent, I may not want that to be available in a public space. And even if I've given informed consent and I've participated voluntarily, the impact 10, 15 years down the track might be, oh, this is not something I want to have appearing again. We have issues of identification and anonymity. So again, I'll come back to photographs, not the only example, by the way, but we might take photographs of what we see. We're being able to identify individuals that were not even part of the scope of the study. They simply happen to be there. at the time a photograph was taken. And we've got to be able to look at how do we ethically deal with that situation. Are we going to track down or attempt to track down every individual in a photograph or a video that our respondents take and get their sign off on informed consent? Is that even possible? Observational research, we look at the patterns, but we don't necessarily visually represent that individual. But when we are using creative arts-based methods, the production, the output, so the photograph, the video, may become part of the dissertation output as well. We have to focus on plagiarism and honesty, especially if we're working with technology-enabled research. There are going to be issues associated with plagiarism as we're taking other people's artistic work. So how do we represent that? How do we acknowledge that? It can be done, not an issue. Our challenge as a researcher is how are we going to do that? Image capture of others, which we've talked about. Okay, someone sort of went voluminous there. We've talked about.
Já conhecemos essas.
Os panadinhos, os camarõezinhos. E depois temos esta.
Okay, that person can go. All right, so let's get to the last point. We also have copyright issues. As a researcher, we try not to plagiarize, we try not to we try not to infringe on the copyrights of others, which includes when we use images, diagrams, everything else. If you ask a respondent to reply, to provide imagery, to provide drawings, etc., anything arts-based, the question is not copyright, the question is who owns the copyright. And there is a very strong chance that your respondent owns the copyright, not you as the researcher, which means you may have challenges in replicating that as evidence or artifact in the research production that you do, your dissertation or whatever. So that's something to think about. Now, this is not an exhaustive understanding of ethics. My point is, look, most of these issues we face as researchers. What we've got to think about is if we are engaging with any form of creative research, we have to be able to look at our approach to ethics and say, is there something else I need to consider? Which means my ethics application to my ethics board or to my internal review board also needs to change. Now, this slide is, I'm going to put this up tomorrow on social media. This is some really good resources that you can go to read more about creative methods. Now, I've put 4. There's actually lots out there. CARA 2015, Helen Carr is probably one of the world leaders in terms of understanding and embracing creative research methods for social sciences. She's probably the foundation person who brought it all together and said, this is the issues and this is what you can do. Her book's very good. You can buy it online. It's available in ebook format, so it's very easy to obtain, and it's, I believe, actually very affordable. She's edited the Bloomsbury Handbook of Creative Research Methods as well, which is coming out, I believe, December this year. So it might be your Christmas present to yourself. By the way, it can be a Christmas present to me too, okay? But the other 2 are just some experiences. There's a special issue in the International Journal of Research Methodology from a couple of years ago. And the whole special issue is just looking at issues related to creative methods to understand marginal or marginalized communities. The final one is actually lessons from a project that happened in the Netherlands. And they just explore what they learned about how creative and arts-based methods were responded to. Now, in terms of Brooks et al. And van der Vaart, I can actually share those through our social media channels as well, because they're available online quite easily. But for Helen's books, you definitely have to look out to purchase it. There are other resources, but I found these ones straight to the point and very relevant in that respect. So I'm going to move over to